The honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too am very glad to rise on this motion of privilege that's in front of the House today, and I want to thank my other colleagues, my colleague from Caribou, Prince George, and Brantford Brant for their speeches today. I know I've been working with the colleague from Brantford Brant on the Ethics Committee. This issue actually came before the Ethics Committee almost a year ago, Mr. Speaker, that we started looking into the SDTC scandal. And even then, we just started scratching the surface of what was to come and what has led us to this point here today. But I want to go back August 12th, 2020, just over 4 years ago, Mr. Speaker. Of course, the world, we were dealing with the uncertainty of COVID at that time. I know the House was operating in the Committee of the Whole, and I remember I gave a speech. We were just starting at that time to really understand the extent and the scope of some of the sole source contracting that was going on. In particular, there was an issue with CMHC at the time, Frank Baylis with ventilators. We were seeing this level of insider cronyism start to take its root within the Liberal Party, and sole source contracts related to COVID matters, COVID equipment, etc., was being given to Liberal-connected insiders. And I want to go back to what I said over 4 years ago, August 12th, 2020. And I said at that time, I was just sitting right over there where the honourable member from Edmonton Manning is right now. I said at the time that the sponsorship scandal will look like a speck of sand in a desert when this is all over. And when this is all over, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister at the time, Bill Morneau, will be just fine. I said, I have a question to ask on behalf of every Canadian before more stories surface, because they will. How many more Liberal-connected friends, families, and insiders have had their palms greased and have personally, financially gained from this pandemic at the expense of Canadians who have suffered so much during this crisis? Will the Liberals be honest for once, or do we have to wait for the Auditor General to tell us? Well, the Auditor General has been telling us, Mr. Speaker. Several investigations later, we land onto the SDTC scandal. And what a scandal it has become. Liberal-connected insiders and cronies greasing their palms to the tunes of hundreds of millions of dollars without any thought of conflict of interest, without any thought that somehow there was to be some measures put in place that would stop the fleecing of taxpayer dollars to the board of directors who were running SDTC. And I think it's important that we remember again, what got us to this point, and that it was the Auditor General who found that the Prime Minister had turned sustainable development technology into a slush fund for Liberal insiders. I remember being at the meeting where she presented her report and how she talked about the malfeasance that was going on within SDTC, the fact that there was very little oversight and a whole lot of conflict of interest going on. Now, I remember, and I've heard some of the questioning that's been going on today from the Liberal side about criminality. Well, it wasn't the Auditor General's task or role at the time, Mr. Speaker, to be looking into criminality. What she was looking for was how taxpayer dollars were landing in the hands of Liberal insiders without any regard for conflict of interest rules. That's what she was looking for. And that's what she was reporting on, and that's what shed the light on the extent and the scope of this scandal that had started at the Ethics Committee almost a year earlier. The other thing that the Auditor General found, that there was a recording of a senior civil servant who slammed the outright incompetence of the Trudeau, of the government, and I apologize for that, of the government. which gave out $390 million worth of contracts inappropriately. The whistleblower was speaking about the very things that were going on. And I recall at Ethics Committee, we had Doug McConaughey there, and he had been recorded by the whistleblower. They were talking about this scandal, and even Doug McConaughey at that point was saying that this was on sponsorship level scandal. It was a sponsorship level scandal. Now, the sponsorship scandal was $40 million, which is enough money, and then, of course, we all know what happened there. And it led to the Chrétien government being brought down. But this, Mr. Speaker, is upwards of $400 million. $400 million of taxpayer dollars that were being funneled to Liberal-connected insiders and cronies without any oversight. The Auditor General found that SDTC gave $58 million to 10 ineligible projects, and that on occasions couldn't demonstrate an environmental benefit, not one environmental benefit or development of green technologies. $334 million, over 186 cases, went to projects in which board members held a conflict of interest. I mean, it's unbelievable. And $58 million to projects without ensuing contribution agreement terms were met. Think of the coordinated effort that it takes among those board of directors and among the people that were involved in this to distribute that amount of money to what we now know in many, many cases were companies that they had a financial interest in, Mr. Speaker. That doesn't border on criminal. There's nothing that does, quite frankly. The Auditor General also made it clear that the blame for this scandal falls on the Prime Minister's industry minister, who did not sufficiently monitor the contracts that were given to Liberal insiders. And so it was common sense Conservatives that really started the process of trying to get to the bottom of this. We had the industry minister in at Ethics, and we had a report that was done, an audit report on this that we had asked for. We got it back, and it had been redacted, and then the Ethics Committee had asked that we get the report unredacted, that the report actually come to us, and we did, finally, after a lot of push-pull. But I think it's important at this point, Mr. Speaker, to really talk about why these oversight committees are so important to Parliament. The Standing Committee on Ethics, Government Operations and Public Accounts, the mighty OGO, as we like to say. It's important because these committees are chaired by opposition members, and I've been the chair of ethics now for 2 years, and that's why I'm glad to speak on this, because in my role as chair, as you know, Mr. Speaker, there is a level of neutrality that is required in that role, and that we have to make sure that we're operating in a neutral way and a neutral function, and giving a fair chance for all members. But these committees are run by the majority opposition members, and their intent is to hold the government to account. In the case of the Ethics Committee, we deal with, obviously, ethics issues, and we've been dealing with a lot of ethics issues. I refer to it as the shooting the fish in a barrel committee because of the amount of ethics scandals that we've been dealing with, and I'll touch on those a little bit later. But OGO, the mighty OGO, dealing with government operations, contracts. We found through OGO the Arrive scam scandal and how that played itself out, and of course public accounts. And this, quite frankly, this issue has been touching many, many committees, not just oversight committees that are led by the opposition. And so we have been trying to do our job, our constitutional responsibility as His Majesty's loyal opposition, to get to the bottom of these many, many scandals that have been occurring, and we've been doing a very, very good job at that. Sometimes, quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, with some opposition from the opposition. We've not always had team players with other parties. We certainly saw that when the coalition agreement was on with the NDP and the Liberals. The NDP would provide cover in many cases for motions that we were trying to pass in order to shed light on many of these scandals. We've seen hopeful signs, I would call it, lately, that they backed away from that, and that we are getting to the bottom of many of these scandals, not the least of which is the Who's Randy scandal that ethics and now this Parliament are currently seized with. So when we look back on SDTC and we look at what their mandate was, they were a federally, and still are, a federally funded nonprofit that approves and disperses, was supposed to, $100 million in funds annually to clean technology companies. The key problems, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is that SDTC executives awarded projects in which they held conflicts over $330 million worth of taxpayer funds. And in 2019, former Liberal Industry Minister Navdeep Bains began removing Conservative executives on SDTC when there weren't any scandals in relation to the fund, and started replacing them with Liberal-appointed executives. And the Prime Minister's newly appointed board began voting companies in which executives hold active conflict of interest in SDTC funding. Governance standards at the fund deteriorated rapidly under the leadership of the new chair appointed by the Liberals, Annette Versteuren, who we had at Ethics Committee, and the Auditor General and both the Ethics Commissioner as well back in July initiated separate investigations after those whistleblowers came forward with allegations of financial mismanagement at the fund. And the Auditor General's investigation, as I said, Mr. Speaker, found severe lapse in governance standards, and it uncovered almost $400 million in funding that was awarded to projects that either should have been ineligible to receive funding or were awarded to projects in which board members were conflicted during that 5-year audit period. Just incredible, incredible stuff, Mr. Speaker. So I wanted to talk about a little bit of history here, and it's not just the SDTC scandal that we should be focused on, or that Canadians should be focused on. It's a myriad of other scandals as well. And as I said, as chair of the Ethics Committee, I've had a front row seat over these last 2 years to many of these scandals that have come forward. And I had a front row seat, Mr. Speaker, when I was opposition House Leader under our interim leader, Candice Bergen. And it was at that time that we were really dealing with the Winnipeg lab documents scandal, the fact that the government had not provided documents that were asked by Parliament. In fact, dug their heels in so much that they actually took the Speaker to court to prevent these documents from being released. And we've seen a very similar situation here. There was nothing in the order by Parliament. And Mr. Speaker, Parliament is supreme. When committees ask for documents, there is an obligation on behalf of the government to provide those documents. And if they're asked for in an unredacted manner, there is an obligation, because of the supremacy of Parliament, to provide those documents unredacted. That wasn't the case here with the SDTC scandal. And when I go back to the Winnipeg lab scandal, almost exactly the same thing happened. These documents were not provided for. What did they have to hide? What do they have to hide? Who's connected? Who is further connected to this SDTC scandal that this government doesn't want us to understand or know? And why would they not want the potential criminality to be exposed in this scandal? And these are questions that the government is going to have to answer, and their members are going to have to answer when and if we do get to an election. But it wasn't just Winnipeg Labs. It wasn't just SDTC. It was the Arrive scandal. Again, $60 million plus given to Liberal-connected insiders for the Arrive scam application. And again, no answers, pushed back. We had to call Mr. Firth to the bar. Again, proving the supremacy of Parliament and the fact that we are the arbiters of what we need to determine and what we need to get to the bottom of. There was also the Trudeau Foundation that we've been dealing with at the Ethics Committee. We've been dealing with foreign interference at the Ethics Committee. Oversight committees intended to hold the government to account. Whether the government likes it or not, that is our constitutional role. As it's our constitutional role as His Majesty's loyal opposition to push and fight and make sure that government is on the up and up, and that taxpayer dollars, that we are the stewards of taxpayer dollars. And we will continue to do that. And now we're dealing with another situation, as I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, that Parliament is now seized with, and the ruling of the Speaker on the point of privilege that was brought up by the member from Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes. You're going to help me out with this? Leeds, Grenville, Thousand Islands, Rideau Lakes. You think I would know that by now because we sit on the Ethics Committee together. But we're dealing with another question of privilege that I'm sure this House will be seized with over the next few days that are coming on the Who's Randy scandal, and the fact that the minister was seemingly operating his business while he was a minister. The conflict of interest in that is palpable, Mr. Speaker. The illegality of that is real. And we need answers to that. And back in July, the Ethics Committee had a meeting. We had requested documents from a witness, Mr. Anderson, who failed to provide those documents to the committee. And we gave him a timeline. This is when we need them by. And he failed to provide the information that was requested. And again, asserting ourselves and the supremacy of not just the committee but Parliament, I reported to the House what had happened, as was the committee's wish, Mr. Speaker, and then the member rose on a question of privilege and the fact that the privileges of the committee and the privileges of its members were not adhered to by Mr. Anderson, and the Speaker ruled that the question of privilege is now before the House, and the motion has been duly moved, and it's a motion that we'll be debating likely over the next couple of days, perhaps even into next week. And part of that motion is to have Mr. Anderson come to the House, come before the bar, to be admonished by the Speaker, but more importantly, answer the questions that parliamentarians have been asking him for. And that's our job, not just on ethics, but on the mighty Ogo, and of course, public accounts as well, Mr. Speaker. And it all goes back, and I know you've heard this a couple of times, it all goes back to 2015, when this Prime Minister stood up before Canadians and said that they will be transparent and open by default. In fact, it was in the throne speech of 2015. And all of the examples that I've been citing over the last few minutes, Mr. Speaker, proves that this is a government that has not been transparent and accountable and open by default. In fact, they've been anything but. And part of our responsibility on the Ethics Committee is to deal, Mr. Speaker, with access to information. And I would suggest to you, and we issued a report on access to information a few months back after studying it and having experts come in, members from the media who have been involved in the access to information system, and it is broken, Mr. Speaker. Oftentimes, the wait time for access to information documents are months, if not years. Information comes that's redacted. That's not open and transparent and accountable by default. That's anything but, Mr. Speaker. So, as I conclude, it's not just the system that's broken in this country in many ways. The affordability system, housing, the fact that young people are, they've lost hope. They're despondent now of a prosperous future for themselves. The division that this Prime Minister has sown in this country along regional lines, race lines, faith lines, pitting neighbor against neighbor, all these things are broken. And the worst part about what's going on right now is not only have we got a decline in democracy as a result of this government not being open and transparent and accountable by default, but it really speaks to the diminishment of our institutions and the ability of Parliament to ask for the information that it requires in order to protect the people of this country and to protect their money. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'll conclude by saying this, that I am extremely disappointed that we are on this path once again, and that the only thing that's going to change this is a change of government, a common sense conservative government. Hopefully that happens soon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.